All right, good evening, good morning, or good day, depending on when you're watching this. This is number 2 of the Anglish Arts, the first video I've retitled. And I think it's just a better title to go with going forward. And then some of you may be familiar with the sacred geometry term. I'm going to correlate that as well, but that may very well be the actual term. But since I'm also dealing with language, including character sets, sigils or sigils, letters and typography in other videos, for me it all falls under Anglish Arts, which, if any of what I'm positioning is correct, could fall under sacred geometry or vice versa. In this one, it's not going to be too deep. I'm just going to further elaborate on the basically just what we see here, this two lines opposing each other in equal fashion, equilateral fashion, and not get too much into language itself. And we're actually going to start over here. Now, some of these symbols, everyone should be familiar with these in some fashion or another. We're dealing specifically with the Latin cross here, not because I chose it, but because it actually fits with exactly. I started with my decoding of typography and sigils in general. So sigils, just a refresher, I consider the lowercase letters to be sigils. The uppercase capitals may be, but I think that's actually related more to law. Not just legal law, but all variations of things that we consider law, as well as chronograms, which are Roman variations of numbers. So it could correlate that way. I haven't got that far yet, and there may be other people who have gotten that far. I am not that far right now, so I'm not going to address that too much. Again, this one we're just sticking with the Anglish Arts and geometry. And the 3 symbols that I'm using are the golden mean, which is the spiral, the trinity, the exact proportions of the pyramid, and the sacred cross, and I'm just going to call it the cross point for now. And again, I didn't choose this, the Latin one over here. I serendipitously found it as I was working through these. So what I did is I basically built a triangle to the exact proportions of the pyramid, built a golden mean in relationship and scale to that, and then built a cross using the same measurements. So everything was built in proportion to one another. And what I found when I overlaid them was how similar, right here in the dead center, right in the center, how similar they look to the Eye of Horus. So let's just stop right there. I'll let that settle in for a minute. I understand there may be some very evolved and very established notions behind the Eye of Horus already, and I've read many of them myself. But in the previous video, I mentioned how most of our notions, or in this case, every popular notion in science, philosophy, religions, and alchemy can be visually rendered, represented, or demonstrated with a line and a circle. And just to sort of describe that visually, we have a line of sight and perspective. We have a boat's stern, or the astrological system. We have time and distance, right? Clock hands, and depth and dimensions. And they're almost the same. So this is sort of referencing a space, and then how we identify coordinates and depth and mass, and even something as like the azimuth, how the sun is calculated in terms of distance. And so I needed a little bit of a way to reverse engineer this, just to see if any of this had any validity. If I just made this cross up ornamentally, right? If I came at this from a graphic designer standpoint and just wanted something to look symmetric using the proper proportions. And what I had actually found was this graphic here, and I think you can find this pretty easily with a couple searches that somebody had laid out. And sure enough, with the exception of the fact that they made thicker line strokes, the only cross that it fit with was the Latin cross, not the Greek cross, not the Maltese cross, not the cross of St. Andrews, which I think actually should be like this. And this is actually incorrect, but I'll get to that in a minute. This is not the correct patriarchal. I kind of got one drawing that was accurate, and then a couple where the artist either has other different reference, or, I mean, this isn't even the correct proportions for the papal cross either. They actually follow this proportion here, where if you look at the top graphic where I'm showing right here, you have this line and you have this line. These would be the exact proportions of the patriarchal cross, and that's noted officially. So I serendipitously, again, by accident even, found these proportions to work perfectly. At least just revealing the visual symbol here, which looks like, if we were to put a little staff on there, I mean, it really does look like the Eye of Horus without a lot of inference from myself. So with that, another serendipitous discovery, thanks to, again, keeping in mind that I had no intention to do these things. I was just trying to examine the existing symbols themselves visually with what little I was trying to with what I've already correlated in a little way to language, and how the English letters are not just ornamental value, but they have associations to philosophy, religion, alchemy, and biology, most likely. And yeah, you could throw in astrology and stuff too, but for now I'm throwing that actually into religion and philosophy, since I think they're all sort of the same knowledge base. But so I found this graphic on a channel called Sacred Geometry Decoded. It's known as SGD, and he does some really cool and interesting research, not related to what I'm doing, but who knows, it may correlate at some point. And that graphic, this graphic here, was found on his video, so check that out, or don't. But you know, I'm just giving an attribution where it belongs. And what he's showing here are some sacred measurements that he pulled out and extrapolated from the Vitruvian Man drawing. And that drawing, he often says or references that many old texts, ancient texts, esoteric texts, refer to man as the measure of all things. And it's my understanding, and my original translation of the Vitruvian Man was that it basically represented man within his own space and man within man-made space. And he went ahead and did some really detailed research that pretty much eliminates what I thought, or it could correlate with it. I'm just translating it poorly. And with that, he came up with the specific measurements that it's actually encoded in there as man being used to measure all things, literally, like the finger, the thumb, the foot, the meter, the yard. Excuse me, it's late here. And he found those proportions and the numbers to work out well, and then went through a bunch of other great stuff showing how the cubit was derived or could have been derived, and how that's incorporated into other stuff. And he makes a lot of great correlations. And if you're not familiar with the math, you don't have to be. You just have to recognize what he's doing, not actually be able to do it. Although, you know, it's worth your time to learn how to do it. So going back to my drawing here, my little my icons, when I put this together, you know, I was like, what would this mean? And I've just been sort of mulling that over for almost a year now. And what he's showing here is that this is actually how we measure time officially with the pendulum. This is the exact proportions of a pendulum, which he's showing right here, and then the swing. And that is the precise actual size of this here from the Christian cross or cross point. Now, if we use the patriarchal cross, right, we have another triangle, and I haven't made that correlation just yet to anything, but I'm guessing now that I've done this, it does exist. And just to back up a little bit, this is the exact proportions of the pyramid, and it happens to fit perfectly both with the Latin cross and the patriarchal cross without any inference from myself. So even if you don't accept the swirl or the golden rule, or the golden meaning, golden proportions, which is how that's referenced, that's fine. I still think that this is too coincidental to be overlooked right away. But I don't think anyone on average would recognize the significant coincidence, and I'm happy to call it that, the significant coincidence of discovering that overlaying these three objects in dead center, precise center, would have given us the proportions of the pyramid and the exact pendulum swing triangle when flipped over that we use to measure time. And I'm working on that a little bit, and I'm not sure what that means, but or if it means anything, but it's a little too coincidental. So I went back to the cross and just drew this out and just sort of looked at this symbol for a little bit. And, I went back and I've got a little bit of research into other stuff. And I mean, this is the only other thing I've seen ever that's referenced like this. I think some people would assume it actually is a perfect, diamond. Or Metatron would be a perfect diamond, but it's possible that that's not what it means at all. I don't know. Perhaps Metatron was an icon or a symbol further back in history, and I got mistranslated. Perhaps it was technology. I don't want to get into the ET or alien stuff, but, whatever. I've gone this far. I've made a lot of inferences already that people might object to, so I don't have any problem with that. And then, of course, there's Metatron is closely tied with Michael, the archangel, or if you're, I would say, Italian and some Greeks, you recognize this as Michael Mass. And then, of course, just break it apart and using my English, it's really archangle. And this is the arcangle. That's what the arcangle would be called, because they're referencing an arc without potentially maybe not having a word for a curve. Again, etymology is going to be critical as I go through this and figuring out what words were used when, how they were used, how they were translated into Italian, Spanish, and all these other languages. And then, of course, the keystone, which is just a word, whether it's key and stone or key and stone, and the key of Solomon and all these other references to keys and stones or rocks or cornerstones. Depending on the weight you're putting above your arch, it determines, and also the width of your segments, the length of your segments. I think that actually is what defines where you place your keystone, whether you place it this far down or this far down, and how you craft it in relationship to the arcs, the amount of degrees that you use to break up the arc. And with that phrase, right, the amount of degrees that we use to break up the arc, just using that phrase alone should give everybody a little bit of, Masonic insight, because it's quite possible that while we use steps often, or we see steps referenced in Masonic art, some of the most famous pieces that are passed around by people doing research into esoteric literature and alchemy and things like that are highly detailed Masonic drawings and paintings where we see people on steps and, You see all the various ranks that people go through, or degrees. I think just referencing dividing the Ark, or the Ark of the Covenant, into degrees. Maybe there's, not to insult Masons either, but maybe perhaps that there's some etymology associated here too in translations that need to be addressed. Again, this whole presumption is on the fact that English may be older, or a root language, or in fact was devised after the fact to be an all-encompassing universal language, using specific characters and sigils to both reference the old knowledge or to imbue and embed it in there so that it never got lost as long as the language was spoken or written down, which is quite possible too, because in most cases when anyone really gets into this kind of research, I'm just gonna move over here. Like, they'll look at these pictures and they'll go through and, look, there's a swirl there and there's an eye inside, and that's good too. But we're always looking at these literal presentations. It's either this kind of thing or a line drawing, and the Ouroboros is eating a tail, and there's the sun and the moon, and there's columns and all this stuff over here. It's interesting. It looks like it's Arabic. The detail of the artwork itself makes decoding very hard, because in fact it almost buries it to the level where only the people who have been told that it exists, that the code exists, or that there may be a code, would even begin to look for those things. So it's purely designed to look ornamental without any value, until someone comes along and says, well, what does this mean, and why does the hat shape like a fish's mouth, and things like that. And I just included the Celtic cross here, and then the Druidic cross, which I think, again, we're talking about sacred knowledge, and that's what I'm really referencing, how easily these symbols just reference our most popular and really complex notions that we all are on some level familiar with. Yet, if I had to create one little icon or symbol for it, I could literally do it with this, and if I had the right word and was able to cast the right spell, a boat's stern is composed of the sacred cross point and the sacred bind, or the Celtic cross, right? Or, as I said, I think I might have mentioned previously, or I didn't actually. I was just reading some to correlate with some of the other documents I've been reading from the CIA and NSA's library. So I was reading some other documents on terrestrial magnetism that the CIA had been researching. I'm not going to go into why, because it's a whole other tangent, but the authors and the researchers in there had no qualms at all with saying that China was the first to utilize the magnetic poles as a wayfinding device or as a compass. They did not invent the compass, but they recognized the phenomenon of the magnetic poles and turned it into a navigation and wayfinding system on their boats. And how they had done it. There's my little boat. I'm sure you've seen movies and stuff. This is not what the Asian boats look like or Chinese boats look like, but what they would do is they would put a picture or a sculpture made out of wood of, say, like, just for example, it's a dragon or a mermaid or something like that. And because they knew how to harness the magnetic through iron and I guess it would be torque is appropriate word. They knew how to harness the torque from the pull. What would happen is if they veered off their course, the wooden statue would rotate or turn to where they needed to go. The dragon would turn to show them where to go, or turn in a specific way if they were going the wrong direction based on their coordinates, or if the poles had shifted, they would know by the way their wooden dragon would turn. And if you're a ship's mate, or perhaps just somebody hanging out on the boat, or just an extra hand, and you had no idea that the captain was aware of this as a piece of technology on their boat, do you think you would ascribe that to magic? Do you think you might perceive that as some sort of miraculous technology? Or say you're a religious person and, maybe we're talking 1000 BC now. This is when this document that I was reading references China being able to use the polar torque for navigation on their shipping and their boats. 1000 years BC. Do you think that you might later on, even if it's a couple hundred years later and we start to see the emergence of various types of religions, do you think that you might think that that was magic as well? Or if it was a dragon and you just thought this creature looked very, maybe you didn't like the visual that was being used and you just thought it was a demon controlling or guiding this boat. So with that, my point of going through that is just to show how really vast and confusing some of the knowledge we have and how it's been mistranslated and misrepresented or mispresented. And with that, I just want to jump over here to another interesting YouTube video that I think's pretty good. There's a guy named Randal Carlson. If you don't know who he is, excuse me. I don't know what he's more popularly known for. It's either his research into occult, his understanding of the deluges that have occurred over the many years. I think he's associated loosely with the same media people that might be involved with Graham Hancock, who's another person who sort of tries to dispel all of, or at least qualify new ideas related to our history, both through symbols and through archaeology and ancient sites. But he had a video that I again serendipitously found, and he actually makes he makes a nice little chart here of some interesting, we'll just call them time periods, and I'll leave that up there. You can pause the video or go check out the video yourself. And then in another presentation that he did, he has this inscription from 2nd century Chinese tomb. So 2nd century Chinese tomb. He who understands the earth is a wise man, and he who understands the heavens is a sage. Knowledge is derived from the straight line, shadow, and that is derived from the right-angled joint. The combination of the right angle with numbers is what guides and rules the 10,000 things. Now that's, as you get deeper, you'll figure out that's used often, both in the way it exaggerates things, but also really connotates what they're trying to solve. But this was on an inscription from 2nd century Chinese tomb. Straight line, a right angle, and rules and guides. He who understands the earth is a wise man. He who understands the heavens is a sage. To me, this is, I think, if you're familiar with any, even just remotely, a little bit of history in China, they're they're really an agrarian society as well as anything else or any other society. So they're going to have a lot of innate knowledge about, let's say, making fertile land and the seasons and maybe possibly the procession, as well as astrology. They're going to have it, whether it's recorded the way we record our stuff or interpreted the way we do, the monkey god and dragons in the sky. And we're all just using anthropomorphisms to describe ideas and knowledge in which we weren't able to record it with what maybe more simplistic means or more highly evolved means of letters and characters and all these my basic argument for English here. And when you look at it, I think one of the excuse me, sorry again. One of the things I didn't get to mention overall was that if we consider a little bit of the pop culture media we've been exposed to and how some of that stuff is performed on media like movies and often referenced in books, the sigil is often done with one stroke. And what I mean is the whole idea is to capture as much information or transmit as much information as we can with the least amount of effort, and I'll just do this. So what you just saw is called a unistroke, right? Or a single stroke to get this complicated character here, which if you saw this in perfect proportions and you were on another planet, you're going to have to assume there's an intelligence or a mathematical component or something like that. First of all, if you can make it to another planet or another distant land or whatever you want to do, you're going to immediately recognize intelligence. You're going to recognize that symbol may have a qualitative and quantitative component to it. And I think that as our language evolved, or as the symbols evolved, I know, let me just make a fake character here, but like as we see things like this in older Hermetic stuff and this kind of stuff, I'm not going to get into what I think it is, but the overall point here is that these all have to have a meaning. The curve, the ball, the cross here. If they don't, the other option is to, let's start with the basics. We'll take a mirror and let's look at it, how it looks backwards, or let's have it in a mirror and see how it'll reflect back. And I think we might discover new things. But overall, the idea was that I think these things were so complicated, like how I referenced this stuff being completely complicated deliberately, that either we reverted back to an English language or the English language was composed in order to make it more simplistic, at least to understand if someone wanted to. Whereas this stuff, after a certain time period, it just becomes no longer translatable unless you have, you're lucky to have a library with, a little bit of reference to it. But without that library, you're not going to figure that out. It just wouldn't happen. So there has to be, as I've potentially mentioned in, I think, the first video related to Anglish Arts, there has to be a way for the memory and the knowledge to persist, remain protected and hidden from those who might misuse it or abuse it or misinterpret it, but also be able to awaken it so that those who do understand it can see it. And we can go through all the quotes you want in the Bible, but I think a lot of that stuff has the same encoding. It's just been too much of it's been attributed to literalisms, while a lot of it has a psychological component and a humanistic component where it's meant to communicate more than just knowledge. And it may be mainly, in other interpretations across the world, this means a man or a tree. And that's just as true. It's easy to see that as well. So I think that a lot of Christianity has humanistic aspects where the philosophy really is on the surface is really just about, like I said, being good to people and being good to one another, where everything you do is a contract between man, nature, and you break that contract, you're going to get the consequences of it one way or another, whether the person retaliates or nature retaliates. And then the more encoding, the more involved and encoded aspects of it are breaking down the English Arts and figuring out what that really means. So I ping-ponged a little bit. You can always pause this stuff that's why I leave these little blurbs up here, but you can always pause the video to stop and see what was written. That this is legitimate and this was just an artistic rendition I went and found the actual patriarchal cross, which is right here. And we can see that even this, without any help from me, is the exact proportions of the pyramid. And when we align those all together, it does give us this symbol, which is suspiciously similar to this. And on that, I'll move into how literal drawings, also maybe pictographs or hieroglyphics, where a variation of Druidic knowledge, where a lot of Druidic knowledge uses the human body and the functions and processes and purpose of the human body to encode knowledge. So their metaphors weren't predicated on gods who threw lightning or gods who punished you. It was, what you're seeing here is that the eye would be used to communicate specific things related to light, maybe, or perception. The hand would be, they would use literal representations, especially in hieroglyphs, of the creatures and the animals and the human body to encode their information. And even that, after a while, without a codex, could be lost as easily as well. So without math, or at the least, let's, again, I've said that all this can be done without math, just knowing what proportions are, right? Just knowing how to divide or divine something. You don't need math at all, as long as you can retain where you started on your or take notes properly, or keep good records. But ultimately, you just need a stick, a second stick, a stick, a rope, and a rock, or as Randal Carlson has elucidated me on, I think it was called a druid rope, and it was a stick with a knot. And they would put it in the ground and divide a perfect circle, or divine a perfect circle from the ground, and then do whatever they were doing. Even the Templars apparently were doing that. So I don't think there's much more to explain. Let me see if these notes here. So the golden mean may have been conflated into the golden rule. Man is the measure of all things, Vitruvian man, as well as the golden meaning. Meaning is plural for mean or average. So meaning could have been turned into an adverb, or construed as an adverb, or, you know what I mean, misinterpreted. Trinity is not meant to be a reference to the Holy Trinity, although with 3 points on any space or object, you can triangulate and begin to build your circle. In fact, 3 points gives you a lot of knowledge and information, and that's exactly what's used for sailing. The sacred cross is a representation of alchemical knowledge as it relates to the 4 elements: divining space, time, anything. It is a bind in order to start, or it's a bind in order to give you the ability to start. And I think I've referenced this before, but I referenced it in tweets, I believe. Star and start using our T's. I don't think there's... I recently saw a guy named Santos, Mr. Astrotheology, who does some amazing videos and has a swath of just knowledge and information, plus is able to speak multiple languages. I found star art on my own. I'm sure a lot of other people have come up with that as children and stuff, but I mean, I don't think it's so funny when we really look at how much of our religion is referencing stars. And while I'm calling it Anglish Arts, it might very well be the star art, right? If we include what he calls astrotheology, or accept a little bit what I call Anglish Arts, that is just as much a star as it is the English Arts or anything else. So the star arts may be applicable as well. And then I've actually done a little bit of translation work on some other words, and I know that I'm going, if anybody sees this and it ever makes it out to anybody, I know I'll probably be I'll get some slack for that. But what I see with the word Templar, depending on how you want to spell it, or it may be just mistranslated, is temperate plane. And when I do that with the star art, that's what I really think. I think of the temperate plane. And when I go back to the Celtic art and the Celtic knowledge and Irish and Icelandic and Norwegian knowledge, the great art is a reference to earth, which is art in the middle. And if you were Irish and said that with an accent, or a Celtic, you might hear ert, which is dirt, right? So you have the great art, which is also a reference to the great alchemical knowledge that the Celtics and Irish had. So the correlations are there, whether you call it the star arts, the great arts, Templar, even in Judaism, there's reference to themselves being the chosen people. I don't interpret this. To me, in my interpretations, is the day star, and I recognize the male and female components to it, and the cube in the middle and all that kind of stuff, and that to me just, I think, further actually promotes or supports at least my understanding of the fractal art, the crystalline, the crest line, and the Christ line. I didn't use that here just because I wanted to get into this tangent and just show some phenomenal coincidences if we use just proportions, right? I had no inclination other than proportions. And those symbols and this sort of these easy correlations could be confabulations, but I don't think they are. I think the whole idea that we see a rock and a tablet with these just really lackadaisical drawings and stuff on it, and I think in some cases we see a lot of fakes and we don't know it. In other cases, I don't know why someone would make a tool when, I guess, a stick in a tablet of clay, or a thumb, which Hebrew often, Hebrew to me looks like it's dipping a finger and thumb. And I think the whole notion of some of the pop culture movies incorporating people using their fingers to draw with blood is maybe a reference to where I'm trying to go, but just removing the hysteria from it and the satanic panic stuff. But I think if I were an older culture with this kind of knowledge, even in a little form of it, whether I was considered advanced or not by modern historians, it's clear that everyone knew how to make tablets and clay and build mortar and had, what we have, Porter cement now, and before then they had variations of cement. Incidentally, there's even variations of cement in blocks that many people think are actually human. They're calcified human remains, some of the colors we get. But it seems to me that a stick and a clay tablet would have been easier to do everything. So to come up with a device that makes perfect imprints, and then I'm not refuting any of this, I'm just saying that to come up with this is a very time-consuming task, and we see how somehow these people were able to document their knowledge and build these vast cities, but they couldn't or didn't come up with a way to reproduce their own language in an efficient way. Yeah, I get that we have the era of the Gutenberg press, and the press was this revealing thing. It was, again, and it is. It's not. I'm not taking that away, but it's very convenient that just happened in one era of time, and no one else could figure out, with all their other vast skills and all these craftspeople and craftswomen and men, they couldn't figure out how to recopy their own work efficiently. And I've seen, I know that the scrolls on the cylinders and all that stuff is pretty ingenious in its own right. And especially some of the carvings that people do. I mean, it was so beautiful. That stuff's so beautiful. But this would have been the most efficient way to do it. And I think whether it was started out as symbols that became transimposed to letters, where the EEE may have meant something specific. Maybe, let's just turn it around for now, just for the sake of my conversation, the trident. And in other cases, we have the Arabic 3, which means star power. It literally means star power. I think that we have to recognize some of these symbols without the ornamental value of thick, bold lines and all that stuff may have just been turned into letters. And if that's the case, or at least the perception of letters and given phonetics, we have to, recognize that the Anglish Arts would have been the most simplistic way to do it. Or, as we've seen with Greek, we have symbols. Yeah, we call them letters now, but doing that has undermined the value of what that actually means, or could mean, or could be forgotten knowledge, so to speak. So this was basically this a little bit of exploration on these same symbols here, and then I just wanted to show what I thought were pretty cool correlations between the actual Christian cross, or a Christian cross, the Latin Christian cross, also the Patriarchal cross, and how they reveal, with not a lot of effort, the proportions of the pyramid. And when you lay the golden mean over that, you have a pretty good reference to the Eye of Horus. So I think that's it for now. Let me just double check. Nothing there. That's it. Alright, so this video is done. I'll come back to this shape often and in some of these shapes just to help further communicate newer ideas. But this tangent it has been put on hold for a little bit because I think it's actually a whole other topic to explore, especially with the motion and exact distances required to make the pendulum work and how we denote time, and that just sort of conveniently fitting in with the Latin cross as well. Again, could be coincidence. I have no proof that it's not, but that's a big coincidence to have both the proportions of the pyramid, the distance from the pendulum that we use to measure time, and the golden ratio being overlaid, both of those objects, which are also highly coveted Christian geometric shapes, and revealing all of our arts sort of do have an origin, at least with proportions and measure. Maybe not math. I don't subscribe to the whole thing, numbers mean everything. I just think that numbers are actually no different in terms of being sigils or symbols, and that we have to make that distinction. Math is another language on its own. It's an esoteric language because everybody can use it differently and to arrive at the same solutions. So, thanks for watching.